Thank you very much for coming. Emma, thank you very much for inviting me. This is the first time I've stood up and talked to a bunch of live people about my pet subject for some time. And this is where we start. It is, as Emma said, about the marriage of soul and spirit. It is about relationship, fundamentally. And it's about engaging. It's about seeking intimacy with the nature of nature itself. And inevitably, that journey leads inside as much as it might be sought on the outside. And by the end of it, I think you'll have a sense that alchemy suggests that life is really a love story. And but it's been a long and strange love story from the start, and it is not over yet, I believe, for any of us. Now, this comes from a wonderful Renaissance manuscript called Splendor Solis, and we will be coming across more of its images. And here is the Red King and the White Queen having a proper meeting and appreciating each other's point of view, but they are not yet as one. Now, one of the key things about alchemy is the way it works through what Jung would call archetypal symbols. And in fact, he discovered alchemy because there were such powerful and interesting symbols being revealed in the dreams of his clients when he was doing therapy as a student, having been a student of Freud's. And of course, he was thinking along very psychological lines in those days, but he was really struck by the power of some of the symbols that were coming through in dreams. So he started exploring la symbolique itself and came across alchemy in that search and was struck over and over again by how closely some of the extraordinary alchemical symbolism that he came across correlated with very interesting experiences and dream encounters that his clients were having. Just to say one further thing with regard to Jung is that by the end of his life, he had stayed with alchemy. He'd written an enormous amount about it, and in fact, he can be thanked for making alchemy respectable in the academy again. And even though there might be many of us who come from a more traditional perspective who think that he might have been missing the point for a very long time before he finally got it, I think we must be careful of underestimating his contribution, and also given the milieu that he was in at the time and the background that he came from, because the work that he did was extremely impressive and useful for any student of alchemy. And here it just gives an idea of how the pilgrim walking through the sacred landscape, seeking that sacred spot, might suddenly have a breakthrough moment when suddenly the way things seem to be, the illusory sort of matrix that we find ourselves living in, can suddenly open up and we can see wheels within wheels, that there are dynamics at play in the way life works that you can't really be taught about in school, and you only know them when they happen to you. But alchemy is something that you don't just explore, you don't go out looking for to read about it and, as it were, ask what it's about. It can just happen to you and you suddenly become interested because you've had, as it were, an alchemical experience. Now we're going to start from the history point of view. When did this all begin? As the psychologist asked the sectioned person, when did this all begin? Well, historically it starts really in China And here's the Chinese flag. Can't think of modern China having much to do with alchemy, but here on the national flag, you still have the five-pointed star, which goes back to the ancient Chinese veneration of the five elements. And the flag is this red, long known as China red, and originally it was derived from cinnabar. And cinnabar is a combination of mercury and sulfur, a mineral, mercuric sulfide. And it's got this wonderful deep red earth blood color. And for the Chinese, this color represented, it was blood, so it was life force, and it also represented for them immortality. And here is cinnabar in its most beautiful crystalline form, where it really looks like pigeon's blood ruby. And they developed a very strong sense that cinnabar was a magical thing. And here you see Titian actually using the pigment originally derived from cinnabar and cinnabar alone, which is vermilion. And here is Titian's Assumption of the Virgin. And I wonder when Titian was using the vermilion, whether he was aware of its association in Chinese thought with immortality, because as the Virgin is being assumed into heaven, of course, she is achieving immortality. Here is a piece of cinnabar carved with the form of a dragon here, the great worm. And interestingly, the word vermilion comes from the Latin for worm, as in vermicelli, the worm-shaped pasta. And that's really because it's the color reminded them of a similar but less penetrating dye that was made from a kind of worm. But I find it interesting that the dragon red, the dragon worm, is familiar. The oldest known Chinese alchemist, the Yellow Emperor, is so legendary that actually recent research has established that he never existed as a human being at all, which I've always found rather disappointing, being a romantic. And of course, anybody who's really interested in alchemy is clearly a romantic from the start. I mean, I've talked about it being a love story. It's a very, very romantic consideration in many ways, which doesn't mean to say it's not logical or irrationalist. But certainly I love the idea of the Yellow Emperor living 2,000 years ago and maybe achieving immortality and being a marvelous alchemist. But it turns out he was probably just a deity, and when alchemy really started to catch on, particularly with the advent of Taoism, legendary deities like the Yellow Emperor, they projected the idea that they were alchemists onto them once they had developed a sense that alchemy itself revealed the profoundest insights into the nature of reality. But there's a Taoist alchemist, dressed in yellow, making a potion, which goes to show that Chinese alchemy wasn't just inner alchemy, which it also was as well. Now, the great emperor, Qin Shi, I think his name was, the one whose incredible terracotta army was discovered just back in the 70s, 8,000 figures, they reckon. He had them all commissioned because he was obsessed with immortality. So rather like the Egyptian pharaohs, he was desperate to have a domain beyond the grave that he would feel at home in, so it had to have a huge army and cavalry and all the support he needed. But even that was not really a compensation for what he really yearned for, which was true immortality. And as his death approached, as he got older, his search for the elixir of the fabled elixir of life became ever more desperate. So he got hold of an alchemist, explorer chap who served him, called Zhu Fu. And he sent him off on an expedition to discover the mystical mountain Penglai. And here is the Penglai mountain, which doesn't really exist, at least not geographically. But the idea was that this immortal, a legendary immortal, a Jian, called Huang Han, who's said to have lived for 10,000 years by ingesting cinnabar, was there, still living on the mountain. And in fact, the emperor had met, he had met in his lifetime another immortal called Angi Shen, who had said that if he wanted to live forever, he must come and seek him out again at the Penglai mountain. So he sent Zhu Fu on this quest, and Zhu Fu never returned. Probably because he didn't find it, and legends say that he ended up in Japan and founded a dynasty there. Now, when he eventually died, the emperor, it was said that he had died from ingesting too much cinnabar, because cinnabar, being mercury sulfide, full of mercury, is very poisonous. And there was a tendency to reject alchemy and to reject the medicinal side of it as vain foolishness, since they were obsessed with taking medicines made directly from cinnabar, which were so poisonous. But of course, that is a nonsense, because everybody who worked with cinnabar knew perfectly well how poisonous it was, because in order to get the mercury out, it's very easy. You just roast the mercury. And if you haven't got modern scientific equipment, you're having to do that out in the open, and the fumes of the sulfur are coming off and the vapor of the mercury is coming off, and anybody who's doing that for more than a day or two starts to get really ill quite quickly. So we're talking about hundreds, not thousands of years of people working with cinnabar, and those people who are working with cinnabar know exactly how poisonous it is. So if they're making potions for longevity and making them according to developing alchemical processes and principles, we can be absolutely certain that they're not just foolishly ingesting poisonous substances. Either way, the poor emperor did die in the end, and the fabled elixir of immortality remained a fabled thing. Now, to move to, before we move on away from China actually, the internal side of Chinese alchemy, this really developed with Taoism. And when I say internal, we're talking about the idea that the human being, him or herself, is really the laboratory within which alchemical operations take place. And here's an extraordinary stone engraving from a monastery called the White Clouds Monastery. I think it's somewhere near Shanghai. And this is about 1,200 years old, I think. And here is a very elaborate, highly stylized figure here, which basically is showing a human being in a very stylized way. This is the backbone, but it also represents the Milky Way, and you have the underworld, and you've got all these different zones going on, and that is Chinese idea of the concept that we know of in the West as the concept of the microcosm, that the macrocosm out there is reflected down below. As above, so below. As Hermes Trismegistus said, who we will meet shortly, we are the microcosm. We are the solar system in miniature. And everything that's on the outside is to be found on the inside. And through working with inner processes, one can reach nirvana, as the Buddhists would call it. One can reach, well, as we will see, immortality itself. Moving westwards, India also has an alchemical tradition, which may be as old as the Chinese. It was always thought that the Chinese alchemical tradition was the most ancient. But a lot of research is being done in both India and China by scholars and historians. And it now seems as if they were developing probably pretty much in tandem. And of course, the Silk Road went in both directions. And it's quite possible that ideas from Indian alchemy were heading east as much as ideas from Indian alchemy were heading west. And here is an extraordinary thing here, because we're going to come to Hermes, who is the patron of Western alchemy soon. And here's a classic Indian yogic thing, which is showing the chakras. And the chakras you may be familiar with, I'm sure all of you to some degree, and they are energetic zones within the body which correspond to cosmological bodies, specifically the planets, the visible planets. And here you have two energy columns, energy serpents, you might call them, called Ida and Pingala. And there you will see they're shown in red and white. And they're very like the Red Queen and the White Queen in terms of the energies that they represent. They are, as it were, masculine and feminine, cold and hot. And as you see, they work together, coming up this central column known as Sushumna. And anyone familiar with the idea of Kundalini yoga, there's the idea that the center of the Kundalini serpent is down in the lower chakra, and that by using the right techniques over many years, one can work with these channels to open up the chakras right up to the point where enlightenment is reached. Indian alchemy developed through the same tradition as Ayurveda. My teacher, Manfred Junius, was a German professor of biology, but he lived in India for decades. And he started studying Ayurveda, became a very well-established Ayurvedic physician in the Brahmin tradition. And he was initiated up to a very high level. He became what they call an Acharya for both his musical ability, playing traditional Indian music, and also for his development as an Ayurvedic physician. And I learned some of the techniques for practical potion making according to the Indian tradition. And this is a form of basma where metals are gradually made organic through the use of milk, yogurt, maybe even urine. You heat them up. You heat up the metal till it becomes a liquid, and then you keep on putting it in the organic liquid, taking it out and grinding it and grinding it and grinding it, doing that over and over and over again, and it gradually starts to break up. Then you start adding in herbs, and you are burning up the herbs, and you're grinding the metal up into the ashes over and over and over. And this is a technique called trituration, and it's also known as, it's a form of comminution, where basically you are dispersing the metal through the ash until there are no visible molecules left of it whatsoever. And at that point, you can create some really, really useful medicines. And there's a zinc basma, for example, which is a fantastic immune supporter, which would be a great thing if you could buy zinc basma out in the pharmacy these days, because it really is wonderfully supportive.
Sorry, can I just say zinc basma? The zinc basma is the zinc that's been ground up.
Zinc that's been made in this way. And I was actually at we did a course, we did a seminar with Manfred Junius in Bohemia, and we made a zinc basma, and it took us 3 days to do it, and even then we were rather rushing through the process. But by the end of it, we all came away with a little bit of zinc basma, and I used it. I had enough to last me for a year or two, and I did not get ill. I did not get ill. So whether that was down to the zinc basma or clean living, who can tell? I suspect the zinc basma. Now, Western alchemy, also the origins are lost in the midst of time. It's hard to tell where it really began. But the oldest texts we have that mention alchemy, or at least talk about some of the principles that alchemy then becomes involved in, comes from the Greek. And the oldest Greek alchemist we know for sure as a historical person was Zosimus of Panopolis. And Panopolis is present-day Akhmim. Is that right, Akhmim? Up the Nile. And Zosimus is about 2nd, 3rd century AD. And the interesting thing is, you will see straight away from here, there's Zosimus, and he's got a sun, sort of halo over his head. And here is his pupil, Theosebia, and she's got a crescent moon on her head. And it's a crescent. I'm not sure if here, yes, here I've got another one. And there's Theosebia. And here she is with another woman, and she's got a full face within the moon, so that's a full moon. And actually this, from the Book of Pictures, as it's called, this is an interesting idea because it says in the commentary, there's not a lot of text, the Book of Pictures is mostly shown in these symbolic pictures. And this is Theosebia's higher self, her inner woman, the one who knows. And the idea is that within all of us, there is this capacity for knowing, and that we already know everything. It's only because we have been drawn away from our state of true understanding that we have forgotten who we really are, where we really come from, and what the story really is, and what the relationship really is. Because here we are, we're all born in relationship. We come out of our mother, we know what we experience, and we've come into a world which is, particularly these days, increasingly unnatural. And we get used to all this stuff and we think that this is the way things really are, but there is less and less access to primordial understanding in the world that we are born into. So we are deeply conditioned. And in a sense, what alchemy is really trying to do is wake up those understandings, that awareness, that memory, this remembering the real parts of ourselves through symbols that resonate in us. Certainly the symbolic way is a profound way of waking up our awareness. Now, it's been said that Zosimus was purely working on the inner level, that it was inner alchemy, that it was purely what you might call a psychological, certainly a spiritual process. But here's a very early Greek text attributed to Zosimus, and it's old enough for that to be most likely the case. And here we have alembics, sitting on their furnaces, and it's quite clear that there are potions being made and laboratory action is going on. And for those who argue, yes, 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 but the laboratory stuff is just a representation, it is itself symbolic, to which I'd say it's important to know that for alchemists there is no true distinction or separation between the inner and the outer. So an alchemist who is working with matter in order to purify it or make a medicine from it, whichever path they are taking, is engaging with the matter in the most intimate way he or she can. And when you're working on that level of appreciation, you are doing it in relationship. And in intimate relationship, we are always identifying with the other. And the more we can identify with the other, the deeper the relationship can go through a magical process, an alchemical process of appreciation. Because appreciation is a multifaceted thing. If you appreciate what I'm saying, you understand what I'm saying. Because that's one meaning of appreciation. And the more you appreciate what I'm saying, not only the more will your understanding be better of what I'm trying to say, but you will be valuing it. Because to appreciate something is to see it for what it is and value it, because it comes from the Latin precio. And precio means prize, to prize a thing because it is precious. And we put a price on it because it has value. And if you have sufficient interest in appreciating whatever the matter may be, then your understanding will indeed grow, just as money in a bank with sufficient interest will appreciate in value. There will be more. So the idea is, the deeper you go into something, the more intimate you become with something, then the more your understanding will grow. The more what you're engaging with will grow and will blossom. Now, Zosimus is the first historical alchemist, but in the background, coming out of the sands of the Egyptian desert of old Egypt, like a dust devil, is the figure of Thoth and Hermes Trismegistus. Now, Hermes Trismegistus is the patron of Western alchemy. He is both the Greek god Hermes and he is the Egyptian god Thoth. And here is Thoth here. He's the ibis-headed god. And there he is in a relief in a temple. I think it's Ramses III in Luxor, behind his throne. And, oops, I want to go backwards actually. Here he is, he's the scribe of the gods. He's also the god of magic, he's the god of alchemy, he's the god of writing, he's the god of communication, but he is also a creator god. He's actually created the gods whom he serves. So he is the magical creator at the axis of the known and the unknown, the created and the uncreated. So he has this extraordinary centrality. And I can't think of another personage on a sort of religious or traditional level who fulfills that role other than really Jesus Christ, representing Logos, and Logos, as it were, in the flesh. But that's not a really very good analogy. But nevertheless, Thoth is the arch-magician who both serves the gods and has created them at the same time. And here we see him with Anubis here, and Anubis is with Mart, and they're weighing the soul of some poor recently deceased person, which is here, against a feather. And if your soul weighed more than a feather, this crocodile-headed god would swallow your soul. So lighten up. Lighten up, or you're going to get swallowed whole. So really, Hermes Trismegistus is born of a fusion between Greek tradition and ancient Egyptian. So this happens after Alexander the Great. You probably know the story. When he died, he had this huge empire. And he didn't even have any kids. He died too young to even raise any kids. And so he divided his empire up amongst his greatest generals. And his greatest general, Ptolemy, inherited Egypt, and his descendants became the Ptolemaic pharaohs. And Cleopatra, who we think of as a proper Egyptian queen, was actually a Ptolemy. She had lots of Egyptian blood because a few generations down the line, rather like the Normans and the Saxons, they had bred in with the local populace. But on a very interesting fusion level between the Greek culture and the ancient Egyptian spiritual tradition, you get Hermes Trismegistus emerging. And there's a whole bunch of texts known as the Corpus Hermeticum or the Hermetica, and they're all attributed to Hermes Trismegistus as if he was a great sage, a living person, but of enormous antiquity, who was said maybe to have lived around the time of Moses. Some said before Moses, some said maybe after Moses, but others say he lived 5 times in different incarnations and gradually becoming more human through his incarnations. But he's an extraordinary mixture of the Greek and the Egyptian. And the first book of the collected Hermetica is known as Poimandres. It used to be called Pimander. It's actually Poimandres. And in Greek, Poimandres figures the word poimon and andros, which is man, humanity, humankind. And poimon is shepherd, Poimandros, so it was the shepherd of man. And what happens in this text is that Hermes is wandering around, and as he says, I'm thinking about all the mysteries of life and pondering hard and praying, and suddenly I had this encounter with this extraordinary presence, this extraordinary being of gigantic proportion, if one can speak of it in any proportion whatsoever, appears and says, I am Poimandres. So that was always translated initially as either just Poimandres or shepherd of man. But very recently, within the last 20 years, it has been established that actually there is a hermeneutical pun going on here. Hermeneutical being a word also associated with Hermes, to do with translation and seeking out the meaning of things. And Peter Kingsley, who's been a very interesting scholar on such esoteric things, established that actually in the ancient Greek language, poimon and andros, or very similar sounding words, I can't give them to you exactly as they are, and nobody really knows how to pronounce them anyway, actually mean the intelligence of Ra. And this is really interesting, because what's going on there is the intelligence of Ra, who is Thoth, is meeting Hermes, who is meant to be Thoth. So you can see that the origin of this story, this text, the Poimandres, is actually more Egyptian than Greek, because it's actually saying the intelligence of Ra, in other words, the Greek, the ancient Egyptian understanding of truth, is superior to the Greek Hermes, who's walking around like a man, like a human being, and he tells Hermes what's really going on, the nature of reality. And it starts off with a sort of version of Genesis chapter 1, really, of creation, or as it is given in the New Testament as well, the sort of traditional Big Bang theory, and the fiat lux, and the voice of God, and I am the Word. So Poimandres is really logos in the form of Thoth, teaching Hermes the deeper understanding of the nature of reality and the true relationship of the human being with the cosmos as a whole and with the divine as a whole, and teaches Hermes to understand that everything is within him and that everything is already known to mankind, because mankind is born into an extremely privileged position and was the beloved of God and the last created thing, and everything that is in God, that is known to God and revealed through creation, is the birthright of man, which is an extraordinarily big gift to have been given. And this really tallies with what Plato wrote. When Plato, in one of his dialogues, I think it's Critias, puts in the mouth of Solon, when Solon visited Greece, all the priests, in Egypt rather, all the priests said, "Ha, you Greeks, you're so young. You've forgotten everything, and that's because your civilization collapsed, and then you forgot everything, and then you had another great civilization that collapsed, and then you forgot everything, and you just keep forgetting and forgetting and forgetting. And for thousands of years, we've been remembering and remembering and remembering." So the Hermetica itself is really an insertion into the Platonic Western tradition of some ancient Egyptian ideas of the true nature of the relationship between humanity and the divine. And it was to go on to become extraordinarily influential in not just the Western esoteric tradition, but also Christianity as it started to establish itself and seek deeper philosophical roots with which to dignify itself, through Platonic ancient Greek understanding and also Hermetic understanding. And here we see Hermes Trismegistus there with the caduceus there. And here he is cropping up centuries later in a Rosicrucian alchemical text. And there he is with his wings, with two caduceuses. And this shows the central role that Hermes was to play in the understanding of Western alchemists as a guiding light, as a patron, and also as a central substance. Because you may have noticed, whoops, let me go back. We may have noticed that we've been talking about Mercury and cinnabar, and the idea of working with Mercury being key to the alchemical laboratory tradition. And the word for alchemy, laboratory alchemy in the Indian tradition is Rasa Shastra. And Rasa Shastra means the work with Mercury. And of course, Mercury is the Latin name of Hermes. And he's also the planet. So we got quicksilver, elemental metal, Mercury. You got the planet Mercury. And you've got the Greek god Hermes, who turns into the father of alchemy. And the oldest text of Hermes, in terms of the copies that we've got, the oldest extant original text, which is about maybe 1st century of the Common Era, is the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, and I'll read some of it out. In truth, without deceit, certain and most veritable, that which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. And just as all things have come from this one thing, through the meditation of one mind, so do all created things originate from this one thing through transformation. So the alchemist is seeking this one thing which can be found through transformation. And the Emerald Tablet goes on to say, the wind carries it in its belly. Here's the wind carrying the child in its belly. And the earth is its nurse. And here's the suckling child at the nurse of earth, which is to say nature. And you've got this extraordinary tradition which starts to develop in the West during the Middle Ages and then really bursts out when the Hermetica come into Christendom, into the Latin West. And that doesn't happen until 1460s, 1480s. And in the Florence of the de Medicis, you've got Cosimo de' Medici, and he's discovered the works of Plato. They have arrived on a boat from Byzantium, from the Greek Christian Eastern Roman Empire, and he gets Marsilio Ficino, who is his great hermeneutic scholar, his great translator, to start translating Plato, which takes years, of course. But the text that Cosimo is most interested in tracking down, legendary text, is the Hermetica, because he only has one of the texts. And that text is a magical text, which is all about Egyptian temple magic. It's about making talking statues. It's about how to bring the gods into statues in their image, and how to talk with the gods through these statues. And of course, Christianity found this rather bizarre and heretical and problematical, and it gave Hermes a rather bad name. But there was this tradition that there were far more writings of Hermes, if only they could be found. So as Byzantium started to fall apart, Constantinople, Byzantium, in the 15th century, with the encroachment of the Turks, Cosimo sent his spies out to get back as much of the old Greek texts from monasteries, from great houses, as they could possibly find, in order to preserve them and translate them into Latin. And in the 1460s, one of his spy monk explorers comes back and he has the Hermetica. And Cosimo, who's an old man by now, says to Ficino, Marsilio, put Plato on the shelf. I must read Hermes before I die. So Ficino starts to translate the Hermetica. And by 1484, they are published. And they have a huge impact. Most immediately upon an extraordinary individual called Count Pico della Mirandola, who is the most glamorous, the most charismatic, possibly the most beautiful, certainly the most educated, and probably the richest young man in the whole of Italy, who is an absolute tyro. And he speaks by the age of 20, he speaks Latin, he's learning Greek, and nobody learned Greek in those. In those days, 15th century, nobody learned Greek. It was just considered beyond the pale. It was old stuff. Suddenly, with the publication of things like the Hermetica, there's this excitement to get into the Greek. And people wanted to jump in and learn for themselves. Those scholars who don't want to wait for Marsilio Ficino to translate the whole of Plato, they're getting hold of the manuscripts themselves and getting people over from Byzantium and going, teach me, because they know that there is incredible depth of wisdom and knowledge, and they've only inherited a certain amount of Aristotle, and Aristotle has not got the whole story. They know that Plato has far more, which of course he does. So Pico della Mirandola, he grabs hold of the Hermetica. He immediately writes a thesis called The Dignity of Man, where he was really saying what we've discovered from that first book of the Hermetica, the Poimandres, going like, oh, what a miracle is man. Oh, what a divine thing is man. We are the microcosm. We are the beloved of God. We have been given the right to choose whatever we want to be. And we can roll around in the gutter. We can soar angelic to heaven as we wish, because this is what has been vouchsafed to us by the Lord. Oh, there's a vermilion worm. I'm not quite sure why an upside-down horse with a vermilion worm in some kind of thing with a crown on it is there, but it cropped up. Here's more of this extraordinary iconography. You can see that there's so much that can't be put into words about alchemical processes. And if you read Zosimus, for example, he's talking about dreams, he's talking about these extraordinary symbolic encounters. He's also trying to explain, as the laboratory alchemists are, they're trying to give an impression of the extraordinary things that are happening in their crucibles as they are working with matter. And what is the matter? What is the matter? Well, the matter is that we're going to die. And if we're going to die, then you're going to be like, if you're the emperor of China, for example, and you're the great thing, you've united the whole of China, but you're going to die, that's what's the matter, because you might be the most powerful man imaginable, but you're going to turn to dust. You will turn to dust. So hence, the prime concern of alchemy is to get real, to find out what is real, what will not die. To get to the heart of the matter, because the matter is that we are all dying. That's what's wrong. So doctor, help me, teach me, what must I do to get to the heart of the matter? So here comes the mercury again. The Western alchemist devised this idea. This idea came along of the prima materia, the one thing. What is the one thing? Well, the one thing is the monad of Plato. It's the absolute. It's the divine that cannot be spoken of in any way, because it is beyond description, beyond all form, beyond all creation, beyond all consideration. But that is the point. It is the point of life. But it's a point just like the compass point on a blank piece of paper before you draw the first circle. It is a thing that is not a thing. Because what is the point? Well, if you try to describe what the point is before you've even made a circle, it's not the center of anything, it's not a thing at all, it's an idea, but it's the most central idea we can imagine. So that is the heart of divinity, and the idea is, upon creation, following the fiat lux, where the word reverberates, the verb, verbum, reverberates upon the void, the matrix, the chaotic waters, and starts to create shapes from it. And there's an interesting experiment that you can do, which you're probably familiar with. That great Japanese scientist, I can't remember his name right now. I think that's him. And he does these, he shows how if you reverberate a dish with sand on it or bowls with water in it, depending on how you're reverberating it, you create different patterns. And it shows how sound reverberation has a direct action on matter. And actually, if you read the latest ideas of great mathematicians like Sir Roger Penrose, the latest ideas of the Big Bang and how that started, they're now reaching the idea, as far as they can imagine it, outside any spiritual tradition, is it starts off with a great reverberation. Before there is this great explosion where everything suddenly comes through, there is this reverberation. So that is the verb, that is the logos, but as soon as it comes through, everything falls into being. But what rules over everything? Death. Down here, nothing is permanent. Nothing lasts forever. Everything is doomed to die. So nothing is fundamentally real except the idea of it. And again, it's the Platonic idea. Plato had this idea that everything has its perfect forms, its idea. So tiger, tiger, burning bright. Tiger's burning bright before it appears as a cub and reaches tigerhood. The idea of tiger was always there, and the idea of tiger will never die. And every tiger that is born is trying to be the most tiger that ever there was. But before tiger, there is tiger forever. So there's the idea that all these things that have birthed have not evolved out of the gloop of glup, out of the stew of possibilities by accident or by some sort of weird sort of Darwinistic thing. What's really happening from the alchemical point of view is that once everything comes into being, all the ingredients are there. And once all the ingredients are there and they've been reverberated on, they come into being. But they don't come into being immediately. It takes a long time for these things to come into being. But from an alchemical point of view, if I may speak for the alchemists, but I've not actually read an alchemist write such a thing, but it seems to me that yes, we can see how Homo sapiens has antecedents in other hominids, the great apes, chimpanzees, and things like that. But we're missing the point if we imagine that we're basically apes, or that we have that much really in common in terms of our sense of being with chimpanzees. Because from the alchemical or really Platonic point of view, what's happened is that the vehicle that we now inhabit was given its opportunity to come into being. And once that vehicle came into being, there we were. Ecce homo. So the ecce homo comes along is when matter allows, then there is in that matter what was always going to be in that matter, which is the spirit of it, it's the idea of it. Now, how to get into the heart of the matter? There's the idea of the prime matter, the prima materia. And the prima materia is that first thing, that first matter, which was then reverberated into all these shapes and all these possibilities. But the idea is that has fallen. So what we need to do is find what that matter is. What is the matter? What is that particular matter? And they say, the alchemists say, well, it's a common thing. It's everywhere. You know, dogs chew on it in the street. We walk over it in the dust. Kids play with it. It's everywhere to be found. It's a thing that isn't a thing. And I can assure you, I've been exploring the alchemical writings and the alchemical tradition for a long time in my little span, but say 30, 25 years at least. And I honestly cannot tell you what the prima materia is. But I do believe that it is a thing and that it can help you into the work. Interestingly, going back to my teacher, Manfred Junius, he was told when he was initiated into alchemy as part of the Ayurvedic tradition, once he'd reached a certain point and become an Acharya, he was initiated into alchemy and alchemical techniques. And his teachers told him that yes, although turning base metal into gold was not the central concern of Indian alchemy, nevertheless, it was there and it was done and it was still being done. And the last time it had been done was to create gold in a particular temple to help fund Gandhi's mission for independence, peaceful, non-violent independence. And I find that really interesting because, A, that's a phenomenal idea, but also we're talking about the most initiated, educated, traditional people who don't tell jokes, who aren't trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. And if they're saying that to somebody like the professor of biology who's got to that point, it seems to me it's probably a true story. Just to say, in terms of the Philosopher's Stone, let me confess, I believe it is a real thing, that thing which can turn base metal into gold. If it were not for scientific prejudice, and one was to explore all the evidence of all the stories about live transmutations being performed in front of a skeptical, highly informed audience, one would have to deduce that it had happened and that the gold that had been produced was produced the way it was claimed to have been produced. But, of course, it's like the Indian rope trick. If you weren't there, you say it could not possibly have happened, and anybody who says, but I was there and I promise you it happened, you would say, well, I love you, friend, and I tend to believe everything you say, but since that's impossible, then you must have imagined it, because he must have been a magician who was just using these tricks. And we know how clever these magicians can be, like David Blaine or whoever it is. We know how easy it is to fool people, and so tricks can be used. But I do honestly believe that certain people have become so intimate with matter that they have achieved a privileged relationship. And once you've achieved a relationship with matter on such an intimate and privileged level, you've gone beyond where actually the laws of nature establish themselves. Because there is a grey area, well, I don't know if it's grey because I ain't been there, but where consciousness is simply at play with whatever it is that it is with, and everything at that level of presence knows what it is. Everything is fundamentally what it is, and if there's sufficient presence, then there is nothing else going on. And it's at that point that miracles can occur. Now, I've got rabbiting on now and laid down my confession, but I just want to show a few more pictures, because this is called the royal art of alchemy. And we talked about the royals, like the great emperors who were seeking immortality. But here's some more of the art. This is Splendor Solis again. This was attributed to the teacher of Paracelsus. Paracelsus is late 15th century, early 16th century, after the Hermetica were published, and he avidly read up all of that. And Solomon Trismegistus, which was supposed to have been his teacher, it's clearly a nom de plume, an alchemical name. Whether such a man existed or not, we don't know. He's attributed with having discovered the Philosopher's Stone. And there are some interesting legends which suggest that there might be something to this. But Paracelsus was a fascinating chap because he became the most celebrated physician in Europe. He was renowned as an alchemist, a doctor, a surgeon. He wrote a book on surgery, which was the standard text for maybe 200-300 years. He was living during a time when there were wars going on everywhere. And he wandered around Europe. He wandered as far as Russia, out to the Middle East, right out, came to Britain. He was up in Scandinavia. Everywhere he was going, and he was talking to gypsies, he'd be talking to miners, and be talking to people in all kinds of communities, learning from everybody, their laws, their understanding, their folklore, their medicine. And he had a saying that nature was an open book for those with the eyes to read. And knowledge was there being revealed to us all the time. So nature is a sort of theophany. And the whole of nature is medicine. And that's like the Native American Indian tradition. If you understand what they mean by medicine, it's this ability to read signs and see things for what they are. So everything is symbolic. So if you meet an eagle, that's eagle medicine. And if you happen to see an eagle does something that really captures your attention, then pay attention, because there may be a message for you from eagle. And eagle medicine is very specific in terms of what it means. In the alchemical tradition, eagle has very specific meaning. Have I asked on for about 2 hours?
Well,
maybe?
no, for an hour, but I know that you'd like to take some questions, and I'm not sure what time they close.
Well, I just do want to rush ahead and actually get down to some real specifics and just talk about some principles here. This is more of the Splendor Solis, and it's going through stages of the art, and it is beautifully done. But let's get to the heart of the matter, because this is a science as well as an art. And the alchemist is working with these inner cosmos and the outer cosmos. The outer cosmos is immediately the solar system. And the solar system consists of for the ancients, it was the visible bodies. So the classical planets, the visible bodies were, of course, the Sun, the Moon, and Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. And they all appear to revolve around us because we appear to be at the heart of things. And certainly the way we see it, that's the way it is. Now, it's interesting that we still have the days of the week named after the 7 visible wanderers, the ones that appear to move around independently against the fixed signs of the zodiac, the backdrop of the galaxy. And here we have a pentagon here, which shows the order of the planets, order of the days of the week: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So, of course, Sun is Sunday, Moon, Monday, Tuesday. Well, that's a Germanic thing, but that is in the Latin, it's Mardi, Mars Day, and Wednesday, Woden's Day, Saxon, Germanic. Well, that's also Miércoles, Mercury Day. Thursday, Thor's Day, is actually Jupiter's Day, Jove's Day, Jueves. And Friday is Venus, so that's Vendredi, Viennes. And Saturday, Saturn Day. And here we see the metals which are associated with them. we have the symbols for the metals are gold, silver, iron for Mars, the red planet, quicksilver, Mercury for fast-moving Mercury, tin for Jupiter, copper for Venus, and heavy lead for slow-moving Saturn. Now, the interesting thing is one imagines that these are just old conventions. These are the ancients going, oh, well, you know, yes, this bright golden sun. Yes, the silvery moon. Oh, yeah, and the reddish iron for Mars. And they're just projecting these associations onto these things moving around. And they're calling them gods at the same time. And that this is some kind of archaic way of projecting internal realities, or the requirement for gods to be real, as it were, on the outside. But what's so fascinating, particularly with this, is that the way these things link up. So here we have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and you think, well, that's not in any particular order, except it's the orders of the day of the week. Why should that be the case? Well, nobody's really sure, because we know from the Bible that the Sunday is the last day of the week, upon which it's the Sabbaths when the Lord rested, although that's actually Sabbato Saturn, but hey. Nevertheless, it seems to be a rather odd order. But when we go, according to this pentagram, we follow what's called the Chaldean planetary order. Heptagram. What am I calling it? Oh, foolish man. I'm so glad you interrupted. Please, will you interrupt? Whenever I'm saying something really obviously stupid, please correct me. Otherwise, I'll just go on until it becomes really embarrassing. With quite. Heptagram. For the 7, of course. So here we have an obtuse heptagram, as it were. And we follow the Chaldean planetary order, which is the speed at which the heavenly bodies appear to move around us. Then we're working from the moon, which goes around in a month. And then we're going to fast Mercury, and then Venus, and then the Sun, and then Mars, and then Jupiter really slow, Saturn really slow. So there we've got a really nice relationship between the order of the days of the week and the Chaldean planetary order. So that's nice, but doesn't seem to really prove anything. But then when we go to the metals associated with the planets, we get something really interesting, because here we have an acute heptagram, and this is the metals in order of atomic number. So these are the so-called noble metals. These are elemental metals. How did the ancients, would the ancients have had any idea of the relative weights in terms of atomic number of the metals? If so, how so? But here, if we follow from Venus to Saturn, that we have this order within the same heptagon formed by the days of the week. So here we go, from Mars rather. We go from iron to lead to quicksilver to gold, tin. Oh no, I'm doing that wrong, aren't I? But you start off with Mars, copper, silver, tin, gold, quicksilver, and then to lead. And that's really, really fascinating, because there is an order there which really associates the metals to the planets, who are the gods, who are celebrated in the days of the week. Now, there was a woman called Lily Kalisko who worked with Rudolf Steiner, and Rudolf Steiner said to her one day, this is very interesting, why don't you set up an experiment to see if you can show that there is a direct correlation between planetary movements on the outside and the metals with which they are associated. So she set up a brilliant experiment called called capillary dynamolysis was the technique she used. So she uses basically blotting paper with metal salts in solution. So she's using stannous oxide for tin. She's using gold chloride. She's using silver nitrate. She's using these salts of the particular metals associated with the planets and sticking rolls of blotting paper in them and taking photographs and recording every day for, I think, a period of 2 years, an extraordinary labor of love. And she is reading the patterns or checking the patterns as they appear. I don't know, you know how it is if you drop ink onto blotting paper. It gradually spreads out and it separates, and the different components within the ink separate out. So you get this, ringed effect. And that's what you have with capillary dynamolysis. You get these particular patterns and these shadings. And she was able to show that as planets were changing their relationship with each other in the sky, such as coming into conjunction or going into opposition, that those specific aspects, as they were going through, would show up in the capillary dynamolysis. And she produced all the evidence for it. Science paid no attention whatsoever. A few anthroposophists paid attention. A few alchemists said, yes, certainly, that all makes sense, we agree. But one friend of mine did actually replicate her experiment. And he found that it was actually so. So there we have it. I think I'm going to end right there, just to give the impression that although we're working with what appears to be highly symbolic principles, such as the planets actually being gods and actually being related to specific metals, and those metals actually having properties which prove the relationship, then we can see that the alchemists are starting to work with some profound hidden realities that actually elude scientific explanation to this day.